The air was heavy with the smell of hay and leather, the kind of scent that clung to old barns and wide-open fields. Beyond the wooden fence of a small ranch outside a sleepy Texas town, a horse pawed at the dirt, tossing its mane against the late afternoon sun. Its chestnut coat shimmered under the golden light, muscles rippling with restrained energy. The calm of the moment was broken by a girl's hesitant footsteps, the sound uneven, guided not by her eyes, but by the hand of her father. "Careful, sweetheart," whispered Richard Hale, a man whose tailored suit looked painfully out of place against the dusty backdrop. His grip was protective but trembling, his body stiff with unease. Every movement betrayed a man who had spent his life behind glass doors, bank ledgers and conference tables, not in places where boots crunched against gravel and animals breathed hot against your skin. Beside him, little Emily clutched a folded white cane against her chest, her other hand tight around his. At just 10 years old, her pale blue eyes revealed nothing, sightless since birth, and yet her face tilted upward toward the sound of the horse's breathing, lips parting in wonder. "Is that him, Daddy?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a fragile hope. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Yes, Emily, that's the horse I told you about." He hated himself for the shakiness in his tone. A man of his stature, a bank director who commanded rooms with his presence, couldn't even bring confidence to his little girl's dream. For years, Emily had begged to feel what it was like to ride a horse, to sense the freedom of galloping across open fields. But Richard, widowed for 4 years now, had always found excuses. Too dangerous, too impractical, too impossible. Until today, the decision hadn't been his. It was born out of desperation, after overhearing Emily whisper to her late mother's picture, "Maybe in heaven I'll ride a horse, Mummy." The words had crushed him, shaking loose something he'd buried under work and wealth. He couldn't give his daughter sight, but maybe, just maybe, he could give her this. But he didn't know how. He wasn't a man of ranches or horses. That's why he stood there, rigid and out of place, waiting for the stranger he had been told could help. The sound of boots striking wood announced his arrival. From the barn emerged a tall figure, hat tilted low, denim worn, spurs jingling faintly with each step. Sunlight cut across his weathered face, lined with years of labor under merciless skies. His presence was quiet but commanding, the kind that drew attention without asking for it. "Mr. Hale?" the cowboy asked, his voice deep, steady. Richard nodded, clearing his throat. "Yes, you must be Matthew." The cowboy tipped his hat, then looked down at Emily, his gaze softened, losing its edge of caution. "And you must be Emily." She smiled shyly, turning toward the voice. "Hi." "Howdy," Matthew said, kneeling so his voice came closer to her level. "You ready to meet Starfire?" Emily's fingers twitched against her cane, and she whispered, "More than anything." Richard's chest tightened. That hope in her voice, it was brighter than he had heard in months, but it also terrified him. Because he knew what it meant if something went wrong. He imagined her falling, the horse startled, her fragile body breaking against the earth. He almost pulled her back, almost said they were leaving. But then, Emily stepped forward, reaching for the sound of Matthew's voice. Richard froze. For the first time, his daughter wasn't clinging to him. She was trusting someone else to guide her. And that's when he realized the real fear wasn't that Emily might fall. It was that she might rise, and he wouldn't know how to catch her anymore. Matthew placed a gentle hand over Emily's, guiding it to the horse's neck. The animal lowered its head, exhaling warm breath against her skin. Emily gasped, her whole face lighting up like a lantern in the dusk. He's real," she whispered. "Daddy, he's real." Richard blinked rapidly, fighting the sting in his eyes, and for the first time in years, something inside him began to break. The ranch seemed to breathe differently once Emily's small hands rested on the horse's neck. She giggled at the silky brush of the animal's mane against her fingers, her head tilting as if listening to secrets only she could hear. Richard stood behind her, stiff as a marble statue. Every muscle in his body screamed to pull her back, to remind her that horses were unpredictable, dangerous. But there she was, radiant with wonder, and he knew any interruption would shatter the fragile magic of the moment. Matthew rose slowly, his weathered boots crunching against the dirt. He glanced at Richard, noticing the man's jaw locked tight, shoulders hunched like a storm ready to break. "She's a natural," Matthew said gently. Richard frowned, his tone clipped. "She's never been around an animal like this. Don't mistake curiosity for ability." Emily turned her face toward her father's voice, her brows knitting. "Daddy, I can do it. I want to do it." Matthew stepped closer, speaking softly so Emily could hear, but without challenging Richard directly. "Starfire's gentle. He's carried children before. The trick is letting him feel her trust." Richard's chest burned with irritation. Who was this cowboy lecturing him about trust? He'd built an empire on control, on never leaving things to chance. Trust was for dreamers and fools, and Richard had buried his dreams with his wife's coffin. Still, he watched as Emily traced the horse's ears, giggling when the animal snorted in response. Her laughter was light, unguarded, a sound he hadn't heard since before the hospital, before the nights filled with her tears in the dark. He swallowed. "How do you know she won't get hurt?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Matthew looked at him squarely. "Because I've been where she is. People told me what I couldn't do. They were wrong. Sometimes the only way to keep a spirit safe is to let it run." Richard bristled. "You're asking me to gamble with my daughter's life. And you're asking her to live without ever knowing freedom," Matthew replied evenly, his eyes never wavering. The words landed heavy, almost cruel. Richard's lips parted, then shut again. He felt Emily's hand slip back into his, small and warm. "Please, Daddy. Just this once?" Silence hung between them, broken only by the rustle of wind through the nearby cottonwoods. Richard wanted to say no. Every instinct screamed it, but her pleading voice cracked something inside him, the sound echoing memories of his wife's last days, how she too had begged him to let life in, even when death was closing in. He clenched his jaw and nodded stiffly. One step at a time, nothing reckless. Matthew dipped his head in acknowledgement, but a glimmer of defiance sparkled in his eyes. He led Emily closer to Starfire, showing her how to run her hand along the reins. She listened intently, her movements slow but confident, as though she had been waiting her whole life for this lesson. Richard followed reluctantly, his polished shoes kicking up dust he couldn't quite shake off. Watching Matthew's steady patience unsettled him. There was an ease in the cowboy's manner, a quiet assurance that felt alien in his world of contracts and numbers. Emily suddenly laughed, clutching the reins proudly. "He likes me, Daddy, I can feel it." Richard forced a smile, though worry gnawed at his gut. Then Matthew looked at him, his voice low. "She's ready for the saddle." The words were a thunderclap. Richard stiffened. "Absolutely not. We agreed. Just introductions." Emily's face fell, her smile collapsing. She turned toward her father, voice trembling. "But Daddy, I'm not afraid." Richard opened his mouth, prepared to put an end to this, when Matthew's voice cut through. "Mr. Hale, she's stronger than you think. The question is, are you?" The sting of the challenge was undeniable. For a moment, Richard saw himself reflected in Matthew's gaze, not as a powerful banker, but as a man terrified of losing the only thing that mattered. Emily tugged at his hand again, whispering, "Please, Daddy, just a little ride." His chest tightened, torn between fear and love, between control and courage, and before he could answer, Matthew was already leading Starfire toward the mounting block, his hand steady on the reins, his eyes silently daring Richard to stop him. Richard's breath came heavy as he watched Matthew guide the horse closer to the wooden mounting block. Dust swirled lazily in the warm air, but inside Richard a storm raged. His polished shoes seemed absurd here, planted in dirt he couldn't control, in a world where the rules he lived by held no power. "Stop!" Richard said, his voice sharper than he intended. "This has gone far enough." Emily froze, her small shoulders stiffening. She turned her face toward him, her unseeing eyes wide. "Daddy?" Matthew paused, reins in hand, but didn't turn around. Instead, he spoke calmly, almost as if addressing both father and daughter at once. "Mr. Hale, I won't push her further than she's ready to go, but she is ready. You can hear it in her voice." Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't know my daughter." Matthew finally turned, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Maybe not, but I know what it looks like when someone's been caged by fear. You've kept her safe, but safe isn't the same as alive." The words sliced through Richard, leaving him raw. He wanted to snap back, to remind this cowboy that he didn't understand what it was like to be a single father, to carry the weight of a fragile life on his shoulders alone. But the image of Emily clutching her mother's photograph, whispering about riding horses in heaven, rose unbidden, and it silenced him. Emily's voice broke the standoff. "Daddy, I just want to feel what it's like. Please, I promise I'll be careful." Her hands reached out, trembling, as if she could bridge the distance between her father's fear and her own yearning. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. He remembered the hospital waiting room, the long nights of surgeries when doctors gave him no promises. He had sworn then he'd never let Emily be hurt again. But what if protecting her was also breaking her? Matthew stepped closer, speaking softer now. "I'll walk beside her every step, my hand on the reins, my arm ready to catch her. She won't be alone up there." The quiet assurance in his tone was infuriating and yet strangely comforting. Richard hated that he wanted to believe him. Emily tilted her face toward Richard, her small fingers searching for his hand. When she found it, she held it tight. "Daddy, don't you want me to fly just once?" His breath hitched. She had never spoken like that before. Fly. The word pierced him, stirring memories of his wife's laughter, of her belief that Emily's blindness wasn't a prison, but a different kind of freedom. She had begged Richard to raise Emily with courage, not caution, and he had failed her. His grip tightened around his daughter's hand, torn between two worlds, the world of control, where nothing bad could happen, and the world of trust, where his little girl might finally feel alive. He let out a long, shaky breath. "If anything happens—" "Nothing will," Matthew said firmly. Richard hesitated, then gave a single, reluctant nod. Emily squealed softly, bouncing on her toes. "I get to ride, Daddy? Really?" Richard forced a smile through his fear. "Yes, sweetheart. Really?" The relief on her face was radiant, her joy spilling into the dusty air like sunlight breaking through clouds. Matthew guided Starfire to the block and gently placed Emily's hand on the saddle. She traced the leather with reverence, her lips parting in awe. Richard stood close, his heart pounding as though each second stretched into eternity. With Matthew's steady guidance, Emily lifted one foot into the stirrup. Her small body wobbled, and Richard lunged forward instinctively, but Matthew's hand was already there, strong and sure, steadying her. "Easy now," the cowboy murmured. "I've got you." Richard's heart clenched as he watched his daughter, blind yet fearless, climbing higher than he ever dared allow. And when Emily finally swung her leg over and settled into the saddle, she let out a gasp that carried the weight of years of longing. Richard's eyes burned, because for the first time he realized the truth. This moment wasn't about him keeping her safe. It was about her finally being free. Emily straightened proudly, her hands gripping the reins. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice quivering with joy, "I'm really on a horse." Emily's first step into freedom had begun, but the fragile balance between Richard's fear and her courage was about to be tested in ways none of them could predict. Emily sat tall in the saddle, her small frame framed by the fading orange light of the Texas evening. Starfire shifted beneath her, powerful muscles rolling with each step. The horse was calm, steady, almost sensing the fragile miracle taking place on his back. Richard stood so close he could almost touch his daughter's leg. Every nerve in his body wound tight like a coiled spring. His hand hovered in the air as though ready to catch her, though he knew if she fell, there'd be no way to stop the impact. Matthew walked on the opposite side, one hand lightly on the reins, his voice calm and measured. "You're doing great, Emily. Just breathe with him. Feel the rhythm. He'll listen to you." Emily's smile was radiant. "I can feel him moving like music. Daddy, it's like I'm floating." Richard forced a chuckle, though his chest ached. "Easy, sweetheart. Don't let go." Her laughter rang out across the quiet field, a sound so pure it made Richard's throat tighten. He hadn't realized until this moment how much of her childhood had been shaped by his fear. He wanted to hold on to this joy forever, but dread clawed at the edges of his heart. The first setback came quickly. A sudden gust of wind rattled the nearby barn doors, sending them clattering. Starfire tossed his head, letting out a sharp snort. Emily gasped, her hands jerking at the reins. "What's happening?" Richard lunged forward. "She's losing control!" Matthew's voice cut through, firm but steady. "Easy, Emily. He's just startled. Talk to him. Let him hear your voice." I can't," she cried, panic flooding her tone. "Yes, you can." Matthew guided the horse closer to a stop, placing his hand reassuringly on Starfire's neck. "Tell him it's okay." Emily's chest rose and fell quickly, but then she whispered, shaky at first, "It's okay, Starfire. It's okay." The horse stilled, breathing heavily through flared nostrils. Emily's grip loosened just enough to ease the reins, her shoulders relaxing. Relief poured from her in a rush of laughter, half tears, half triumph. "I did it, Daddy. He listened." Richard stood frozen, his heart still hammering. He wanted to pull her down, to end this madness before something worse happened. But the glow on Emily's face stopped him. She had faced fear and conquered it. Matthew met Richard's eyes across the horse, his look quiet but unrelenting. "You see? She doesn't need saving every time. She needs believing." Richard looked away, ashamed at the truth of it, but the struggle didn't end there. As the ride continued, small challenges arose. Emily leaned too far forward once, her balance faltering until Matthew steadied her with a quick hand. Another time, she pulled the reins too sharply, and Starfire sidestepped nervously, nearly unseating her. Each misstep tore at Richard's nerves, feeding his belief that disaster was only a heartbeat away. "Maybe this was a mistake," Richard muttered, half to himself. Matthew heard. His voice was low, edged with grit. "The mistake would be keeping her on the ground forever." Richard's temper flared. "Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to lose everything, to wake up every day terrified of what else life might take." Matthew's expression darkened, a shadow flickering across his face. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he focused on steadying the horse, guiding Emily gently in a circle around the corral. Finally, he said, voice rougher than before, "Don't assume I don't know loss, Mr. Hale. You'd be surprised what I've buried." Richard blinked, caught off guard. There was a weight in Matthew's words, a heaviness that hinted at scars deeper than the ones weathering his skin. For a moment, curiosity sparked through Richard's fear, but it was quickly drowned by the immediacy of watching his daughter ride. Emily raised her chin, her face glowing with determination. "Daddy, I can do it. I'm riding all by myself." Richard wanted to correct her, that Matthew was still guiding, that she wasn't truly alone, but he bit back the words. Because in her mind, in her heart, she was riding by herself, and nothing he could say would matter more than that feeling. Yet as Starfire carried her around once more, Richard noticed something else. The cowboy's hand trembling slightly on the reins, his jaw tightening as though bracing against memories that haunted him. For the first time, Richard wondered if Matthew wasn't just teaching Emily. Maybe he was trying to heal something inside himself too. The thought unsettled him. Because if that were true, then this fragile balance they had created could collapse at any moment. And Richard wasn't sure if his heart or his daughter could survive the fall. Emily's triumph was undeniable, but Matthew's unspoken scars and Richard's growing fear loomed like storm clouds. ready to shatter the fragile peace of the ride. The evening air grew cooler, the sun sliding lower until streaks of crimson bled across the horizon. Emily's laughter carried across the field, bright and unrestrained, as Starfire circled once more under Matthew's careful guidance. Each step of the horse seemed to lift her higher, as though she were escaping the weight of her blindness, of her father's constant sheltering. Richard leaned against the fence now, his polished shoes caked with dust, his arms folded across his chest like armor. He wanted to be proud. He was proud. But pride was tangled with fear, with the aching question of how long this fragile dream could last before it shattered. Matthew walked steadily beside the horse, one hand close to Emily's ankle for reassurance. His movements were calm, practiced, but Richard noticed the faraway look creeping into the cowboy's eyes again. The shadows of loss he had hinted at earlier seemed to grow heavier with every step. Finally, when Emily begged for just one more lap, Matthew stopped Starfire near the fence. He spoke softly to her. "How about we give him a rest, darling? Horses get tired too, same as people." Emily slid her hands down the reins, nodding reluctantly. "Okay, but I don't ever want to get down. I feel like I'm flying." Her words pierced Richard like a blade wrapped in silk. He couldn't help but wonder, had he stolen this feeling from her all these years by keeping her too close, too safe? Matthew reached up to help her dismount. As Emily slid into his arms, she let out a small squeal of delight, then clung to his neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "You made my dream come true." Richard's chest ached as he watched his daughter embrace a man she'd only just met, as though he were the one who had given her wings. Matthew set Emily gently on the ground, his weathered hand lingering a moment on her shoulder. "No need to thank me, kiddo. You did all the hard work yourself." But Richard noticed the way Matthew's voice trembled, barely perceptible, like a note struck on the edge of breaking. Later, when Emily ran her hands over Starfire's mane, humming to herself in contentment, Richard moved closer to Matthew. His voice was low, guarded. "You said earlier, you've buried things. What did you mean?" Matthew didn't answer at first. He leaned against the fence post, pulling his hat lower over his eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was Starfire snorting softly, the quiet hum of crickets beginning in the grass. Finally, Matthew spoke. "I had a little girl once." Richard froze, the words hitting him like a gunshot. Matthew's jaw tightened, his gaze fixed on the fading horizon. "Her name was Lily. She was 6, bright as the sun, fearless as a wild colt. She loved horses more than anything." His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat, forcing the words out. "One day, I let her ride without me walking close enough. She fell. I couldn't catch her." Richard's breath caught. He could hardly process the weight of it. "She didn't make it," Matthew continued, his voice hollow. "Since that day, I swore I'd never let another child near a horse unless my hands were there, steady. If I could stop just one more family from feeling what I felt, maybe it would mean her life wasn't for nothing." Silence pressed down like a heavy blanket. Richard's eyes burned, his throat tight. Suddenly, Matthew's caution, his fierce insistence on safety, made sense. The cowboy wasn't reckless. He was a man carrying unbearable guilt, determined never to fail again. Richard glanced at Emily, still beaming, her blind eyes lit with joy. He whispered, almost to himself, "That's why you took the risk, not for her dream, but for your redemption." Matthew finally met his gaze, his eyes glassy but unwavering. "Call it what you want. But that little girl of yours, she deserves to fly, and you deserve to see her do it, without letting your fear chain her down." Richard felt the words sink deep, ripping through years of walls he'd built around his heart. For so long, he had lived in the shadow of loss, clinging to safety as though it could protect him from grief. But here stood a man who had lost more than he could fathom, still finding a way to give another child a chance at freedom. For the first time, Richard questioned everything he thought he knew about being a father. Emily called out suddenly, her voice light and full of life. "Daddy, can we come back tomorrow? Please." Richard turned to her, his chest heaving with emotion. And for the first time in years, he didn't know whether to answer with fear or with faith. The truth of Matthew's past had been revealed, and now Richard had to decide whether to cling to control or to embrace the terrifying beauty of letting go. The next morning broke with a sky streaked in pale gold, the kind of dawn that promised heat but still held the chill of night in its breath. Richard hadn't slept. He had spent hours pacing the polished floors of his mansion, Emily's laughter echoing in his mind, colliding with Matthew's revelation. He could still hear the cowboy's voice. "She deserves to fly." By the time he pulled his black sedan into the dusty drive of the ranch, Richard's nerves were frayed. Emily, beside him in the back seat, bounced eagerly, her cane resting across her lap. "Is Starfire waiting for me, Daddy?" Richard forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. He's waiting." But his hands on the steering wheel trembled. Matthew was already saddling the horse when they arrived, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man preparing for something sacred. He tipped his hat when Richard approached, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Morning," Matthew said. Richard nodded stiffly. "Morning." Emily, impatient, stretched out her arms. "Can I get on right away?" "Easy, kiddo," Matthew said, chuckling. "Let's start gentle, same as yesterday." Within minutes, Emily was back in the saddle, her joy spilling into every word. She urged Starfire forward with surprising confidence, her laughter rising as the horse trotted in a wider circle than before. Matthew stayed close, his boots kicking up dust, his hand never far from the reins, but Richard felt his chest tighten with every step. Yesterday had been a miracle, but miracles, he knew, rarely repeated themselves. Then it happened. A sudden crack rang through the air. A hunter's rifle shot in the distance. Starfire reared, whinnying in alarm. Emily shrieked, clutching the saddle horn as the world beneath her exploded into chaos. "Daddy!" she screamed. Richard's heart stopped. He vaulted the fence, his polished shoes slipping in the dirt as he ran toward her. Matthew was already there, shouting commands to calm the horse, pulling hard on the reins. But Starfire, panicked, bolted sideways. Emily clung desperately, blind and terrified. "I can't see, Daddy, I can't see." Richard's instinct screamed at him to grab her, to pull her down, to end this nightmare, but he was too far, too slow. And then he saw Matthew, moving with a strength born of desperation, his body pressing against the horse's flank, his voice deep and commanding. "Emily, listen to me. You're safe. I've got you. Just breathe, darling. Breathe with him. Say his name. Say it." Emily's sobs shook the air. But then, trembling, she whispered, "Starfire, Starfire." The horse tossed his head, hooves pounding the dirt, but Matthew's hands were iron, his voice unrelenting. "Again, Emily. Tell him." "Starfire. It's okay," she cried louder this time. The horse slowed, jerking nervously, nostrils flaring. Matthew pulled, steady as stone, his muscles straining, and then, like a storm breaking, Starfire stilled, sides heaving, eyes rolling, but no longer wild. Emily collapsed forward against the saddle horn, sobbing in relief. Richard reached them at last, his chest burning, his knees nearly giving out. He grabbed Emily's leg, his voice breaking. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Matthew's chest heaved with effort, sweat dripping from his brow, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes never left Emily. "I told you," he whispered hoarsely. "She's stronger than you think." Richard looked at him, stunned. For a heartbeat, he saw not just a cowboy, but a father, one who had failed once and sworn never to fail again. A man who had risked everything, even reopening his deepest wound, to keep Emily safe. Tears blurred Richard's vision. He gripped Matthew's arm with trembling hands. "Thank you, God, thank you." Matthew shook his head, his voice low. "Don't thank me. Thank her. She saved him. She saved herself." Emily raised her head, her cheeks streaked with tears, her blind eyes shining with fierce pride. "Daddy, I did it. I calmed him. I wasn't afraid." Richard broke then, his carefully built walls crumbling. He pulled her down into his arms, holding her as if he'd never let go. His voice shook against her hair. "You were braver than I've ever been, Emily. Braver than me." Matthew turned away, his jaw tight, his own eyes glistening as he looked toward the horizon. For a moment Richard understood. This wasn't just Emily's victory, it was Matthew's redemption. The chaos had passed, but its echo lingered, leaving them all trembling in its wake. Richard knew nothing would ever be the same. The storm had nearly broken them. But in that terrifying moment, Emily had proven her courage, Matthew had faced his ghosts, and Richard had glimpsed a truth he could no longer deny. The ranch lay quiet now, the chaos of the morning giving way to a heavy calm. The air smelled of dust and sweat, but also of something else, something cleansing like the aftermath of a storm. Emily sat on the fence, swinging her legs as Starfire grazed peacefully nearby. Her cane rested beside her, forgotten for the moment, as if she had no need for it in this place. Her cheeks still carried faint traces of tears, but her smile was steady, proud. Richard stood a few feet away, his suit jacket folded over one arm, his shirt clinging damply to his back. For the first time in years, he looked less like a bank director and more like a father, creased, vulnerable, stripped of the armor he wore in boardrooms. Matthew leaned against the post beside Emily, his hat tilted low, arms crossed. His silence wasn't cold, it was reverent, as though he recognized this was no ordinary morning. Emily broke it first. "Daddy, did you see me?" I calmed him down. He was scared just like me, but I helped him. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight. He sat down beside her, the rough wood biting into his dress pants. "I saw, sweetheart, you were braver than I ever imagined." Emily tilted her head toward him, her sightless eyes searching. "Does this mean I can ride again?" The question hit Richard deep. He had spent years saying no, years hiding his fear behind rules and reasons. But now, watching his daughter glowing with newfound strength, he realized the truth. She didn't need a warden. She needed a father who believed in her. He nodded, his voice breaking. "Yes, Emily, you can ride again, as much as you want." Her squeal of joy echoed across the pasture, and she threw her arms around his neck. Richard clung to her, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of hay and hope. When he finally pulled back, his gaze fell on Matthew. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two fathers bound not by blood, but by loss and love. Richard stood, crossing the space between them. His hand trembled as he extended it. "I judged you wrong. I thought you were reckless, but you gave my daughter something I never could." Matthew studied him, then clasped his hand firmly, the grip rough but steady. "All I did was hold the reins. She did the rest." Richard shook his head, his eyes glistening. "No, you carried more than the reins. You carried her dream. And maybe mine too." For a moment neither man spoke. The wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers, the sound of starfire tearing grass. Matthew finally exhaled, his voice softer than Richard had ever heard. "Your little girl reminded me that fear doesn't have to win. Maybe Lily, maybe she'd be proud to see me help another child ride." The name lingered in the air like a prayer. Richard placed a hand on Matthew's shoulder, the gesture filled with a weight words couldn't carry. "She would be." "I'm certain of it." Emily's voice rang out again, bright and commanding. "Daddy, Matthew, come help me pet Starfire." The two men turned. For the first time, Richard laughed freely, without hesitation. He walked with Matthew toward the horse, toward the little girl who had unknowingly healed them both. As Emily pressed her cheek against Starfire's neck, she whispered, "I feel free, Daddy, like I can go anywhere." Richard's eyes filled, his voice rough but steady. "And you will, sweetheart. You will." The setting sun bathed them in gold, painting the ranch in hues of fire and forgiveness. For Richard, the numbers and ledgers of his bank felt miles away, insignificant against the sound of his daughter's laughter. For Matthew, the ghosts of his past felt lighter, soothed by the simple truth that redemption sometimes came in unexpected saddles. And for Emily, the blind girl who had dared to dream, It was the beginning of a life no longer defined by what she couldn't see, but by the courage she had found to ride. The world felt wider that evening, filled with roads unseen but waiting, ready to be travelled. Richard wrapped an arm around his daughter, the other clasping Matthew's shoulder in silent gratitude. And as the last light of day faded over the ranch, one truth lingered in all their hearts. Sometimes it takes the courage of a child, the strength of a stranger, and the breaking of a father's fear to show the world what it truly means to be free.